Many skiers and boarders are quite simply fanatics. The mountains become their temples, and like religious zealots, they will make long pilgrimages to kneel at the altar of the steep and deep. If you are a serious skier or boarder, regardless of where you live on the planet, you know about Whistler and Blackcomb Mountains. If you are a fanatic, you've probably made the pilgrimage. 7,000 acres of skiable terrain, greatest vertical rise on the continent, 3 glaciers, 12 bowls, over 200 runs, longest ski season in North America. In a word, big. In the fast-paced world of the ski resort industry, Whistler has definitely come of age. In January of 2002, the Canadian Olympic Association filed an application with the IOC for Vancouver and Whistler to host the 2010 Winter Olympics. The mountain has come a long way since its humble beginnings of the 60s and its first bid for the holy grail of sporting events. The village at the base of the two mountains has become almost as famous for its watering holes and 5-star eateries. If you are a somebody, or even if you're a nobody, this is where you want to be seen, sipping a beverage and looking good in the latest fashions. The village at Whistler Blackcomb wasn't always this hedonistic playground of the world's elite. Not long ago, this posh landscape was the local garbage dump, dominated by black bears. In the early 60s, Whistler was known as Alta Lake. The only way in or out of the isolated community was by train. The rail line was built in 1914 to promote economic activity. Logging and mining were going to drive BC's economy, and rail lines were needed to move people and raw materials. The area's first tourism entrepreneurs, Alex and Myrtle Phillips, built a lodge on the shores of Alta Lake, and people soon discovered the Wilderness Valley. For many years, Alta Lake was one of the most popular summer resorts west of Banff. People came for fishing, hiking, and having fun in a wilderness setting. Hiking up London Mountain was a popular activity for these early eco-tourists. In the spring, the loggers would come, and for many years, there were 2 sawmills operating in the valley. In the fall, when the snow came, the tourists and the loggers would leave, and only a few die-hard families would spend the winter months in the shadow of London Mountain. Life on the shores of Alta Lake followed this pattern for many years. By the late 50s, tourism had dropped off, and the sawmills had closed. Without a road, Alta Lake was destined to become another deserted whistle stop on the rail line. In the early 60s, a group of business people in Vancouver had their eyes on Alta Lake and were working on an ambitious plan that would change the way of life in the Sleepy Valley forever. In 1962, a group of Vancouver business people, led by Austrian transplant Franz Wilhelmsen, formed an association to develop a site to host the 1968 Olympic Winter Games in Vancouver. They needed a mountain, and Wilhelmsen knew they needed a mountain big enough for a World Cup downhill racecourse. It also had to be close to Vancouver. They decided on London Mountain in Garibaldi Provincial Park. The first thing they had to do was build a 4-person gondola and a chairlift that would get skiers above the tree line. It was a big job, considering they were in the middle of nowhere. In August of 1965, the name London Mountain was officially changed to Whistler. The name Whistler was a nickname the early settlers used because of the whistling sounds of the marmots in the Alpine meadows. Also that year, the government put through a paved road to the valley. The road would change everything. It became much cheaper to transport material and people to the area, and the task of promoting development could begin. They had to convince people to buy property in the valley. This was a pretty bold statement considering that there was no hydro, no sewer or water systems, and the new road from Brackendale was 40 kilometers of narrow, twisting, winding highway, dominated by logging trucks that gave no quarter. But skiers are a stubborn breed, and the developers knew that once people discovered Whistler, they would come. Whistler Mountain opened to the public in February 1966. The price of a lift ticket was $4 during the week, but the ad made it look worthwhile with 4 miles of lifts. There was a 4-person gondola and a chairlift to the tree line, 2 T-bars in the Alpine area, and a day lodge at the top. The day lodge was essential because skiers needed a place to thaw out after the long ride on the red chair. They even had a ski school. This was the cutting edge of Alpine fashion in 1966. It took 45 minutes to get from the valley to the top of the red, not including lineups. Whistler quickly grew in popularity, and 30 and 40-minute lineups on busy weekends became commonplace. The ride from mid-station to just above the tree line on a cold, windy morning tested the determination of even the most die-hard of skiers. But it was worth it. Ski terrain like nothing else in southwestern British Columbia. With 1,300 feet of vertical, Francis Run from the top of the T-bar to the valley was high-speed cruising at its best. Vancouver's North Shore mountains of Grouse and Seymour paled in comparison. The mountain was definitely world-class, but the Vancouver Whistler bid for the '68 Olympics failed. For years, the only mention of the Olympics was a ski run down the north side of the mountain to the garbage dump. In the late 60s, skiing was booming and Vancouverites flocked to Whistler. Word spread, and the faithful were coming from all over. Prime Minister Trudeau and his wife Margaret were visiting Whistler annually and put the mountain in the national media spotlight. Additional chairlifts were opening up more terrain, but growth on the mountain and in the valley was slow-paced. Development on the mountain may have been progressing slowly, but the sport of skiing was going through a revolution. For years, ski equipment hadn't changed much. Lace-up boots that didn't provide much support. Cable bindings referred to affectionately as bear traps. And long skis combined to make it a difficult sport to learn. Few people tried it, and fewer still got very good at it. By the late 60s, this was all changing. The equipment was getting better, and so were skiers. Skiing powder became easier, and powder hounds went in search of the fluffy stuff whenever the opportunity presented itself. Whistler has terrain that is a powder skier's delight. At times, West Coast powder is more like wet cement, but on a good morning, when the weather gods grant a big dump of snow with cool temperatures, powder skiing at Whistler is simply miraculous. As the crowds on the slopes grew, the easy-to-access powder was getting skied out quicker, and people began to look beyond the boundary ropes for the untracked gold. From the top of the T-bars, vast expanses of perfect powder terrain could be seen just beyond the boundary ropes. In the late 60s, 4 skiers were killed in an avalanche just outside the Whistler area. The incident made national news. At the time, skiers killed in avalanches in North America was unheard of. It was a wake-up call for the mountain operators who realized that they needed an avalanche control plan for the mountain. The Whistler Mountain Pro Ski Patrol took up the challenge, and avalanche control became part of their job profile. In the early days of avalanche control on Whistler, 2 members of the team were caught in a big slide and were lucky to survive. Bruce Watt was one of the patrollers buried in the avalanche on that morning. After experiencing firsthand how difficult searching avalanche rubble is, even with avalanche beacons, he became the first civilian to train an avalanche rescue dog in North America. Today, there are 8 avalanche rescue dog and handler teams on Whistler and Blackcomb. Members of the Pro Patrol were also involved in search and rescue and began training volunteers in avalanche recovery. If skiers were going to explore the backcountry, they were going to get lost and possibly buried in avalanches. No one has ever been victimized by an avalanche within the area boundary at Whistler. Avalanche control on the mountain is a big job. On a morning when they do full control, they test the stability of 200 avalanche zones. They work with high-speed explosives, and most of the work is done by hand.
Woo! Good one! Yeah, looks good.
From the top of Whistler, the backcountry calls out to powder junkies. The mountain is surrounded by spectacular powder terrain, but there is a catch. Whenever you cross the area boundary ropes, you run the risk of being caught in an avalanche, getting lost, or both. For those who can afford it, heli skiing is a great way to visit the backcountry, and Whistler Blackcomb has some of the best backcountry skiing anywhere. You travel with experienced guides who monitor snowpack conditions and are experts in avalanche awareness. Throughout the 70s, skiing continued to be the fastest growing winter sport in North America. To satisfy the appetite of the skiing public, ski hills expanded. Whistler was adding lifts and skier capacity, but the mountain still hadn't changed all that much. It was still a 45-minute ride from the valley to the top of the Red Chair. In the late 70s, local politicians and business people began to realize that they had a tiger by the tail. They came up with a plan that would transform the still rather sleepy valley into the home of the largest ski resort facility in North America. The plan called for the development of Blackcomb Mountain adjacent to Whistler and building a village at the base of the two mountains where the garbage dump and squatter shacks were located. An ambitious plan, but the visionaries knew they had something skiers and thrill seekers wanted. In 1975, the Whistler Resort Municipality was formed. It was the first resort municipality in Canada. The provincial government got involved financially and construction of the new village began. At the same time, Whistler installed new lifts on the north side of the mountain to access the new town center. In 1980, Blackcomb Mountain opened, and the village was beginning to take shape. Now skiers had two awesome mountains to choose from, as well as a central village with all the amenities. Whistler Resort Municipality was poised to take the giant leap from ski hill to world-class four-season destination resort. In the 80s and 90s, Whistler was hosting a men's World Cup downhill event every 2 years. The downhill course on the mountain is one of the fastest in the world. Racers fly down Whistler at over 100 kilometers an hour. The event was scheduled in December, a stormy time of the year in these mountains. After a couple of races were canceled because of poor weather, Whistler was dropped from the schedule. But the mountain had shown the world that it was world-class and ready for the Olympics. In the early 80s, Whistler and Blackcomb were owned by different companies and were competing for skiers' dollars. Whistler installed the Peak Chair, opening up spectacular terrain that was previously only accessible by hiking. Blackcomb installed a T-bar to their peak, boasting a few more meters of elevation and the title of Mile High Mountain. The big winners in this display of ski hill one-upmanship were the skiers. From these coastal mountaintops, skiers are treated to a spectacular sight. At their feet is some of the best terrain for skiing on the planet. late 80s, a revolution that was brewing just below the surface of the snow was about to explode onto the slopes. Snowboarding has been a boom to the ski industry. Just when it was looking like growth in the sport had leveled off, suddenly skateboarders were buying snowboards and flocking to the hills. People also discovered that boarding was much easier to learn, and so folks who were never interested in skiing were trying it and liking it. These new Alpine zealots flocked to Whistler and Blackcomb. Today, the area is consistently ranked as the top ski resort in North America. With over 2 million skier visits per year, it's way ahead of the competition. There are high-speed quad chairlifts everywhere. A high-speed gondola transports skiers and boarders from the village to Whistler's tree line in 20 minutes, a journey that used to take 45. When people talk about Whistler now, it's often about the high prices of real estate or how expensive a ski weekend is. Things have changed since the $4 lift tickets, the bad hamburgers in the roundhouse, and the frigid ride up the red chair from mid-station. But what hasn't changed is the mountain. The main reason for the phenomenal success of the area is that Whistler is and always has been a great ski hill. That's why skiers and boarders make the pilgrimage and pay the price. Not because it's trendy, and it is trendy, but because it's an awesome mountain. In 1962, when Frans Wilhelmsen decided on Whistler as his Olympic mountain, a lot of people in the ski industry thought he was crazy. There was nothing there except for some old cabins on the lake. But Wilhelmsen had a dream, and like any true visionary, he persevered. The Wilderness Valley has grown into a world-class destination resort community with multi-million-dollar homes and five-star hotels. Today, there is over 7,000 full-time residents, and the valley is a busy place 12 months of the year. In July of 2003, the International Olympic Committee announced that Vancouver Whistler would host the 2010 Winter Olympics. Unfortunately, Wilhelmsen didn't live to see his mountain fulfill its Olympic destiny. In 1962, not many people believed in his Olympic dream. He believed in it. It just took a little longer than he planned. Today, Whistler is the center of the Alpine universe. Skiing and snowboarding zealots make long pilgrimages to the mountain to revel in its glory and pay their respects. The Olympics are the ultimate test for any mountain. It's been a long journey, but Whistler is ready to show the world its stuff.